At the turn of the 20th century, tuberculosis, or consumption as it was known, had no effective treatment. Beginning in 1909 and for the next 40 years, the Waterfall General Cemetery, now also known as Gurrawarra Cemetery, was the burial site for over 2,000 souls, almost all of whom succumbed to this infectious disease. Today it is more than a heritage site. It speaks of a forgotten people and tells much about healthcare in the early part of last century and the extraordinary impacts of infectious disease at that time. Lying near Helensburgh, north of Wollongong, the cemetery was established as a natural addition to the Waterfall Sanatorium, the only state-run facility dedicated to the treatment of the disease. Though only a few hundred metres away, it was carefully located, out of sight of the sanatorium and the patients who lived, and in far too many cases, died there. Today, the site has almost completely returned to bushland. There is no public access at this time, and it's virtually unrecognisable as a cemetery from the ground or air. The fact that the area is overgrown now also forms an important part of the site's story. It underscores the place tuberculosis held in our psyche and the isolation victims of this dreadful disease felt in both life and death.
The people buried here came from all over New South Wales and also from all over the world. Many of the people who came to Waterfall Sanatorium were isolated from their social networks. Generally this was because tuberculosis at the time carried a lot of stigma, which would be in today's terms comparable with someone who might be carrying HIV. The other reason was that because the disease was debilitating, they'd often lost the resources to basically maintain their lifestyles. And because the sanatorium itself is quite isolated, they were generally at a long way from their social networks.
My connection with Waterfall Cemetery is that my father's sister, my auntie, Gladys Muggeridge, is buried in the Waterfall Cemetery, and she's buried in the Church of England portion, and she's in row J46. And Gladys died in September 1927. And I also have the original certificate from Waterfall Sanatorium for her burial. And the price for her burial at Waterfall Cemetery was £5 and 5 shillings.
Young as 6 years of age were admitted here. And in this cemetery, they aged from days old, whose mother was within the hospital, and to 101 years old. So fancy living a century and contracting tuberculosis, you know. They all are very sad because their families either didn't have the money to bury them, and it became on the state to bury them, or their families would pay, and I think it's £2 for a block of land. The undertakers were sometimes private undertakers, like the regular undertakers servicing everybody else, but some of them were either the Dr. Palmer or Chaz McDermott, the medical superintendent and deputy medical superintendent in the very early days were classed as the undertakers. So they would have had a very, very plain little funeral, I think, the ones that were buried here.
Due to a range of issues, virtually no maintenance has occurred since the cemetery's last burial in 1949. Care of the abandoned cemetery was handed to Wollongong City Council in 1967, along with 4 other general cemeteries that were in use at that time. The 1960s was a period when the historic significance of many sites was underappreciated, with facades of old buildings being modernised and much of what would now be considered historic being torn down in the wave of growth sweeping Australia. Disused cemeteries were often considered unsightly, with 2 in Wollongong converted to parks. Waterfall was a remote cemetery that hadn't been used in almost 20 years and was not considered a priority by the council of the late 60s.
Shortly after the sanatorium opened, we had the first burial here on 18th of May 1909. The height of the cemetery's operations were between 1909 and 1928, when generally we see a burial between every 3 to 6 days. So it was quite busy. We had, over 100 deaths a year in most of those years. In the early years, the rate of recovery wasn't great. What you'd often find is someone would come in and then recover, only to relapse a couple of years later. There was a lot of questions about how to treat tuberculosis. The Waterfall Sanatorium was opened on the open air treatment. So the idea was to try and force cold, fresh, pure air into people's lungs to hopefully deal with the contagion. In combination with a healthy diet and a physical regime, that did cure some people.
I found the grave marker with J46 on it, but no name. It was just a stake driven in the ground and it had been etched into the timber. That's the only mark I've ever seen. And a couple of times I tried to go there and the gates were locked and you could not get through.
Some families suffered multiple losses from tuberculosis. Sisters Josephine Minister and Gertrude French both succumbed to the disease at Waterfall and were buried here. Gertrude died in 1919, aged just 22, and Josephine died 3 years later at the age of 26. Care of Josephine's young daughter passed to her aunt, who tragically also fell victim to tuberculosis over 10 years later at Randwick.
There's a mother, Eunice Sloan. She died in 1918, the same month her 10-year-old daughter died, and then the following month her 6-year-old son died, and they're all buried here in the cemetery.
Each burial holds its own story. Many have been forgotten, whilst others, like Vincent Arena, seen here as a boy, are remembered by surviving families to this day. The disease took people from all walks of life. Other faces from this site include Bernard Patrick Murray, aged 34, Florence Louise Barnard, aged 36, and William Eaton, aged 50. In 2012, in response to representations by local historians, Council began conducting research into the cemetery with the help of specialist consultants. This has included consideration of a broad range of issues, such as site access and burial records, as well as the preparation of a conservation management plan. This information will be used to guide decisions about the site's future management. A balanced approach is required to care for both the cultural and environmental significance of the site.
I would like to think it remains a bush cemetery. I think these people need to lay in peace for a long time, you know. Probably because they've had such a terrible death, you know, that they need to just rest in peace.